My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and the night my daughter decided to redefine my future, the sky above Portland, Maine burst open with fireworks bright enough to make anyone believe in celebration. It was the 4th of July, and the house I had helped renovate with my savings glowed with string lights, patriotic bunting, and laughter that rolled through the open windows into the warm coastal air. My daughter, Claire, and her husband, Stephen, had invited half their neighborhood for a barbecue. Music drifted from portable speakers on the deck. Glasses clinked. The smell of grilled corn and smoked ribs wrapped around everything like a curtain. I moved between the kitchen and patio with a tray of lemonade, smiling when spoken to, stepping aside when ignored. I had grown practiced at taking up less space. 2 years earlier, after my hip surgery and the death of my sister, Claire had insisted I move in just for a while. I sold my condo overlooking Back Cove and contributed generously toward the remodel that added a sunroom and upgraded the kitchen. At the time, it felt like weaving myself back into the center of my family. That evening, though, I understood I had been stitched into the hem instead. The moment came casually, almost lazily, as if it had been rehearsed. Someone asked Claire what plans she had for the fall. She raised her glass, sunlight flashing through pale wine, and laughed. "We're finally getting Mom settled somewhere more suitable," she said. "It's time." There was a ripple of polite curiosity from the guests. I felt every eye tilt toward me, without fully landing. "We found a lovely retirement residence about an hour inland," she continued. "It'll be better for her. Activities, people her age. She's been overwhelmed here." The word floated in the air like smoke. Overwhelmed. I was standing 3 steps away with a bowl of salad in my hands. I set it down carefully on the table because I suddenly did not trust my grip. I waited for her to glance at me, to soften the announcement with warmth, but she kept smiling at the guests instead. Stephen nodded beside her, saying something about the right next chapter. No one objected. A woman murmured that it sounded wonderful. The band struck up a louder song. I felt myself receding even as I remained upright and visible. I looked at Claire, at the child I had raised mostly alone after her father died in a boating accident off the coast of Bar Harbor. I remembered packing her lunches, braiding her hair before school concerts, driving her to early swim practices before dawn. I remembered how fiercely I had guarded her sense of safety in a world that had already taken too much. She avoided my eyes now, not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. "It's really for the best, Mom," she said when I finally stepped closer. "You'll have your own community." The phrase sounded prepackaged, like something borrowed from a brochure. I wanted to ask when this decision had been made, when I had been consulted, when my life had turned into an item on their renovation checklist. Instead, I heard myself say, "Oh," as if she had mentioned repainting a hallway. The fireworks began early that year. Red and white sparks bloomed over the treetops, while applause erupted from the deck. I stood there with a taste of lemonade turning bitter in my mouth and understood something with a clarity that almost steadied me. I had not been invited into this conversation because I was not considered necessary to it. The truth was that the announcement did not begin my displacement. It merely revealed it. When I first moved into their home, Claire had thanked me for helping with her twins, for folding laundry, for managing dinner on nights when her architectural firm kept her late. She had asked my advice about curtains and garden plans. She called me Mom in front of her friends. Over time, the tone shifted. My meals drifted from the dining table to a tray in the den because their schedule was chaotic. My suggestions became interruptions. Stephen took over my pension deposits to simplify the bills, and my Social Security checks merged quietly into a household account I no longer reviewed. When I asked about statements, I was told not to worry. When I bought a new pair of walking shoes, Claire frowned at the receipt and said we all needed to be mindful. I began saving small amounts of cash in an envelope tucked inside a cookbook I doubted anyone else would open. It was not distrust at first, it was instinct. Something in me knew that dependence without transparency is not security. It is surrender. That night, while guests drifted toward the front lawn for a better view of the fireworks, I slipped upstairs. The hallway light hummed faintly. My room, the former guest suite, held the faint scent of lavender detergent and the sharper smell of disuse. I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the muffled cheers outside. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a realization that had been building for months. I did not want to argue. I did not want to plead for inclusion. I wanted my name back. I opened my closet and began to pack deliberately. 2 cardigans, sensible shoes, a raincoat, toiletries, the small cedar box holding my late husband's watch, and the envelope of cash. I left behind the quilt I had purchased for the bed and the framed photos I had once arranged on the dresser. Photos that had gradually been replaced by curated family portraits in which I appeared less and less. I paused at the desk by the window and considered writing a long letter explaining how dignity cannot be outsourced. Instead, I wrote a single page. I will not be relocated like furniture. I need space that is chosen, not assigned. Please do not look for me tonight. I hope you find the independence you wish for me and yourselves. I walked down the back staircase to avoid the crowd. The yard pulsed with color and noise. Children shrieked as sparklers fizzed in their hands. Claire stood near the grill, laughing at something a neighbor said. For a fraction of a second, I wondered whether she would notice my absence before the grand finale lit the sky. I realized she would assume I had retired early. That had become my role, the quiet retreat. I stepped through the side gate, suitcase rolling unevenly over gravel, and made my way toward the bus stop near Forest Avenue. The night air was thick with salt and smoke. Fireworks exploded overhead in unapologetic bursts of brilliance, and I felt strangely calm beneath them. I did not know exactly where I would go. I only knew that staying would require me to accept a narrative in which I was fragile, burdensome, and conveniently managed. I had spent 40 years as a public librarian helping people find information, navigate uncertainty, and claim their curiosity. It seemed hypocritical not to claim my own. The bus station downtown was sparsely populated, a few travelers hunched over phones, a tired clerk behind the counter. A television mounted in the corner replayed patriotic concerts to an indifferent audience. I bought a ticket for the last bus heading south toward Providence, Rhode Island. I had a former colleague there, someone I had not spoken to in years, but who once told me I was welcome anytime. Whether that invitation still stood, I did not know. I sat on a hard plastic bench and watched families hurry past with coolers and folding chairs, flushed with celebration. When the clock above the schedule board blinked 9:45 p.m., the weight of what I had done settled into my chest. I was not simply leaving a house. I was stepping away from a version of motherhood built on endurance. The tears came quietly at first, then with a force that startled me. I pressed a tissue to my mouth, embarrassed by the sound of my own grief. At 72, I was alone in a bus station on Independence Day, trying to convince myself that independence could still belong to me. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The voice was tentative, but steady. I looked up to see a young man in a navy jacket holding a duffel bag. He had kind eyes and the cautious posture of someone who understood that pain can bristle. I nodded automatically. "Just tired," I said. He did not move away. Instead, he sat a respectful distance from me. "It's a loud holiday for quiet feelings," he said gently. The observation disarmed me. I let out a brittle laugh. "That's one way to put it." He introduced himself as Adrian. He was waiting for a delayed connection after visiting his grandmother in Bangor. "She says fireworks make her nostalgic," he added. "They make me think about what we celebrate and what we ignore." Something in his tone, neither intrusive nor pitying, invited honesty. I found myself telling him, in measured fragments, about the barbecue, the announcement, the careful smile that accompanied my future relocation. He listened without interruption, his jaw tightening at certain details. "You deserve to be part of that decision," he said simply. The sentence landed with more force than the fireworks outside. I had not realized how desperately I needed someone to say that. The boarding call echoed through the station. I rose slowly, suitcase in hand. Adrian stood as well. "I hope wherever you're headed feels chosen," he said. I met his eyes and felt a flicker of something I had nearly forgotten: recognition. Not of my age or my utility, but of my agency. "So do I," I replied. As I walked toward the gate, I did not feel brave. I felt uncertain, tender, and profoundly awake. The bus doors folded open with a sigh, and warm interior lights spilled onto the pavement. Behind me, somewhere beyond the city skyline, another round of fireworks thundered. For the first time that night, I did not flinch. I stepped forward, carrying less than I had packed, and far more than I had been allowed to hold. The bus hummed steadily as it pulled away from the station, tires hissing against pavement still warm from the day's heat. I chose a seat by the window and placed my suitcase upright beside me, one hand resting on the handle, as if it were a living thing that might wander off without reassurance. Portland's skyline receded in fragments: brick buildings, streetlights, a distant flicker of fireworks dissolving into smoke. With every mile, the celebration faded, replaced by the dim interior glow of overhead lights and the quiet rustle of passengers settling into themselves. I expected panic to arrive once the city disappeared from view. Instead, what came was an unfamiliar stillness. I had left without a map, without a guarantee, without even informing the one friend I thought I might visit. And yet, for the first time in years, no one was monitoring my movements. No one was adjusting my schedule. My time, at least for the length of that ride, belonged entirely to me. About an hour into the trip, my phone vibrated. I had turned it to silent earlier, unwilling to hear the first waves of confusion or anger. Now the screen lit up with Claire's name. 3 missed calls. 2 messages. My breath caught, but I did not open them immediately. I stared at her name and felt the familiar tug, responsibility, reflex, the urge to smooth and soothe. I imagined her discovering my empty room, reading the note on the desk, scanning the yard for a figure that had already slipped beyond reach. A part of me hoped she felt alarm. Another part feared she felt relief. When the phone buzzed again, I turned it face down on my lap. Whatever words she had prepared could wait. For years, my reactions had been immediate, obedient. Tonight, silence was not avoidance. It was boundary. The bus stopped briefly in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. A few passengers disembarked, replaced by others carrying the faint scent of bonfires and ocean air. A woman with silver braids took the seat across the aisle from me. She offered a polite nod and began knitting without preamble, needles clicking in steady rhythm. I watched her for a while, comforted by the ordinariness of the motion. At 72, I had been described as fragile, overwhelmed, in need of structured supervision. Yet here I was, navigating interstate highways under a sky still bursting with color, capable of choosing my own direction. The narrative that had been built around me felt thinner with every mile. It struck me that dependency had not arrived because I was incapable. It had arrived because I had been persuaded that convenience for others equaled care for me. Sometime after midnight, as the bus crossed into Massachusetts, my thoughts drifted backward. I remembered the day I sold my condo. The way Claire hugged me tightly in the empty living room, promising that living together would be temporary, supportive, practical. I remembered signing papers that transferred a significant portion of the proceeds into the renovation fund for their house, an investment Stephen had called it, in shared comfort. I had believed him. I had believed that proximity would translate into connection. What I had not accounted for was how easily gratitude fades when contributions become invisible. My pension had been folded into household expenses with minimal discussion. "It's easier if we manage everything from one account," Claire had said. I had agreed because I trusted her. Over time, statements arrived less frequently in my name. Questions were met with reassurance, then impatience. I had begun to doubt my own instincts, wondering whether age had truly made me less sharp. On that bus, watching highway signs blur past, clarity returned with almost painful force. Trust is not the same as relinquishing oversight. Around 2 a.m., fatigue settled into my bones. I dozed lightly, waking whenever the bus shifted lanes or braked unexpectedly. In the half-sleep between towns, I dreamt of the library where I had worked for decades. Rows of books, the scent of paper and polished wood, children curled in reading corners. I had spent my career guiding people toward information that empowered them. I had advocated for digital literacy programs for seniors, insisting that access to knowledge was access to independence. The irony did not escape me. Somewhere along the way, I had neglected to apply my own lessons. When dawn began to soften the horizon, pale lavender bleeding into gray, I felt a flicker of anticipation. Providence was not a solution. It was a starting point. And beginnings, I reminded myself, rarely arrive fully formed. We reached the Providence bus terminal just after 6:30 a.m. The city felt hushed, storefronts shuttered, streets washed in early light. I stepped off the bus with careful balance, joints protesting the long ride. The air carried a different scent than Maine, less salt, more asphalt and coffee. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, suitcase at my side, and considered my next move. My former colleague, Helen Brooks, had retired years ago and moved to a small bungalow on the east side of the city. We had exchanged holiday cards for a while before life thinned the correspondence. I had her number saved, though we had not spoken in nearly 3 years. Calling her now felt both hopeful and presumptuous. Still, I had not traveled 2 states to retreat into hesitation. I dialed. Her voice, when it answered, was groggy but unmistakable. "Hello." I swallowed my pride and introduced myself. There was a beat of silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "Margaret? My goodness, are you all right?" I did not give her the polished version. I told her I was in Providence, that I needed a place to land for a few days while I sorted out my next steps. She did not ask for details. "Of course," she said. "Come here immediately. I'll put on coffee." The simplicity of her response nearly undid me. I took a taxi to her address, watching neighborhoods unfold, triple-decker houses, narrow streets lined with trees, murals splashed across brick walls. When the cab stopped in front of a pale blue bungalow with a small porch, Helen was already at the door, cardigan thrown over her nightgown, hair unbrushed and eyes bright with concern. She embraced me without hesitation. The gesture felt different from the ones I had grown accustomed to, no underlying tension, no performance. Inside, her home smelled of cinnamon and old books. The living room was cluttered in a way that suggested ownership rather than inconvenience. She settled me at the kitchen table with coffee and toast before sitting opposite me, hands folded. "Now," she said gently, "tell me what happened." And so I did. Not the abbreviated bus station version, but the full account, the barbecue announcement, the shared finances, the subtle erosion of my autonomy. I expected judgment for leaving abruptly. Instead, Helen listened with a librarian's patience and a friend's fierce loyalty. When I finished, she leaned back and shook her head slowly. "Margaret, you were never the burden," she said. "You were the infrastructure." The phrase startled me. Infrastructure. Essential, yet often unnoticed. The foundation beneath daily comfort. I had not considered my role in those terms. Helen asked practical questions next about bank accounts, property contributions, documentation. When I admitted that most financial management had shifted into Claire and Stephen's hands, her expression hardened. "You need clarity," she said, "and legal advice if necessary." The word legal made me flinch. I had not left seeking confrontation. I had left seeking dignity. But Helen was right. Independence, without information, is fragile. She suggested contacting a local attorney who specialized in elder financial rights, someone she had volunteered with during a community workshop. The idea of involving an outsider felt drastic, yet the alternative, remaining uninformed, felt worse. Before we could discuss further, my phone vibrated again.
Claire.
This time, I answered. Her voice was tight, oscillating between anger and disbelief. "Where are you?" she demanded. I told her calmly that I was safe and staying with a friend. There was a pause, then a rush of words. How worried she had been, how irresponsible it was to leave without discussion, how the retirement residence had been meant to help. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said something I had rehearsed silently during the night. "You announced a decision about my life without me. I chose not to participate in that." Silence followed, thicker than any accusation. "We were trying to do what's best," she said finally. "Best for whom?" I asked quietly. She did not answer. Instead, she shifted tactics, reminding me of the money tied up in their house, of shared expenses, of complications. The subtext was clear. Disentangling would be inconvenient. "I am not asking for a fight," I told her. "I am asking for transparency." My voice did not waver. Years of shelving books, organizing archives, and guiding patrons through bureaucratic systems had trained me well. Information first, emotion later. Claire's tone softened slightly, perhaps sensing that persuasion would not work where guilt once had. "Let's talk when you've calmed down," she said. "I am calm," I replied. And for the first time, it was true. After the call ended, I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. Helen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You sounded like yourself," she said. I realized what she meant. Not the diminished version that tiptoed through someone else's schedule, but the woman who had negotiated city budgets for literacy programs and advocated fiercely for community funding. That woman had not vanished. She had been waiting for permission to reemerge. I straightened in my chair and felt the faint stirrings of resolve. This chapter of my life would not be defined solely by departure. It would be shaped by a reclamation of finances, a voice of space. Later that morning, after a shower and a borrowed change of clothes, I stepped onto Helen's porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The city was fully awake now, sunlight glinting off parked cars, neighbors tending small gardens. I did not know how long I would stay in Providence. I did not know whether reconciliation with Claire was possible or even advisable. What I did know was that I would not return to a house where decisions about my existence were toasted with wine. I had crossed state lines in the dark, carrying little more than essentials and conviction. Standing there in the quiet brightness of morning, I understood that leaving had been only the first act. Protecting myself financially, emotionally, legally would be the next. For years, I had measured my worth by how seamlessly I supported others. Now, I began to measure it by how firmly I supported myself. The fireworks were over. The real work was beginning. The attorney's office sat on the second floor of a narrow brick building overlooking the Providence River. If I had passed it on the street a week earlier, I might have assumed it housed a tax preparer or a quiet consulting firm. There was nothing dramatic about it. No towering glass facade, no polished marble lobby, just a modest brass plaque beside the door that read Law Offices of Daniel Mercer. Helen had insisted on accompanying me that morning. though I assured her I could manage alone. I realized, as we climbed the worn staircase, that her presence was not about capability. It was about solidarity. There is a difference. Daniel Mercer was younger than I expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with thoughtful eyes and the kind of calm that suggested he had heard far worse stories than mine. He greeted us with a handshake that felt grounded, not performative, and ushered us into a small conference room lined with framed certificates and shelves of legal volumes. I had spent decades surrounded by books. The sight of them steadied me. "Tell me everything," he said, folding his hands on the table. And so I did. I spoke of the condo I had sold, the funds I had contributed toward Claire and Stephen's renovation, the merging of accounts under the guise of simplicity. I explained how my pension and Social Security payments had gradually shifted into a shared household account to which I no longer had direct access. I described the barbecue announcement, how my future had been declared in front of neighbors as though it were a seasonal landscaping decision. I expected to feel humiliation recounting it. Instead, I felt clarity. Daniel listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, he leaned back slightly. "First," he said carefully, "you are not powerless here." The word powerless echoed in my mind. I had not realized how deeply it had embedded itself in my self-perception. He explained the basics. Financial contributions toward property improvements could establish equity claims. Redirecting retirement income without clear, documented consent raised serious concerns. Decisions about assisted living placement could not legally be forced upon a competent adult without formal guardianship proceedings. "And based on everything you've told me," he added, "there is no indication that you lack capacity." The simple acknowledgement felt revolutionary. For months, perhaps longer, I had been spoken about in terms of fragility. Overwhelmed, confused, needing supervision. Hearing a professional state plainly that I retained full agency was like stepping into sunlight after prolonged shade. Daniel outlined next steps. We would request full financial records. We would determine exactly where my income had been deposited and how it had been used. We would review documentation related to the home renovations. If necessary, we would draft a formal demand for reimbursement or structured repayment. "This doesn't have to become a courtroom battle," he said, "but it does need to become transparent." Transparency. The word felt like oxygen. That afternoon, Daniel sent a formal letter requesting documentation and clarification regarding my financial contributions and current asset access. The tone was precise, unemotional, impossible to dismiss as hysteria or overreaction. I read it twice before he mailed it. My name appeared at the top in bold letters. Margaret Whitmore. Not mom. Not dependent. Not resident. My full name. The response from Claire arrived sooner than I anticipated. She called first. Her voice carried a tight edge I recognized from her childhood. She used to sound that way when cornered about unfinished homework. "Why are you involving a lawyer?" she demanded. "We were trying to help you." I asked for information. I replied evenly. "You told me not to worry. Now I am worrying." Stephen took the phone at some point. His tone was more measured, but beneath it ran irritation. He spoke about misunderstandings, about shared household expenses, about how complicated finances can become when families blend resources. I let him finish. Then I said, "Complicated does not mean invisible." There was a long silence on the line. Within days, bank statements began arriving electronically through Daniel's office. Transfers I had never authorized. Large sums labeled vaguely as home improvement reimbursement. My pension payments routed into joint expenses without itemized breakdowns. None of it was criminal in the theatrical sense. No forged signatures or hidden offshore accounts, but it was careless at best and exploitative at worst. Seeing it in print did something unexpected. It removed doubt. For months, I had wondered whether I was misremembering agreements, whether I had nodded consent during conversations I could no longer fully recall. The documentation told a simpler story. Assumptions had replaced discussion. My income had become background noise in someone else's life. Claire called again, this time crying. I didn't realize how it looked, she said. We thought it was easier this way. You weren't managing things before. I wasn't managing them because you offered to, I replied. Offering does not equal owning. The conversation did not resolve anything neatly, but it shifted the terrain. I was no longer defending my right to exist independently. I was asserting my right to clarity. 2 weeks later, a significant portion of the funds I had contributed was transferred into a new account Daniel helped me establish solely in my name. Watching the confirmation screen populate with numbers felt surreal. Not because of the amount itself, but because of what it represented. Restoration of control. Helen hugged me when I told her. You look taller, she said with a grin. I laughed, surprised by how light it felt. With financial stability no longer hanging by a thread, I began considering something I had not allowed myself to imagine, my own home again. Not a room in someone else's house. Not a temporary landing pad.
Mine.
Providence offered options, modest condos, small single-family homes, even a converted carriage house that smelled faintly of cedar and possibility. I visited open houses with a mixture of practicality and wonder. No one questioned my presence. No one asked whether I should be somewhere more supervised. One afternoon, I stepped into a small craftsman-style house on a quiet side street lined with maples. The porch creaked slightly underfoot. Inside, sunlight streamed through wide windows, illuminating hardwood floors worn smooth by time. The kitchen was simple, but functional. The backyard held a neglected garden bed waiting for attention. It was not grand. It was enough. Standing in the living room, I closed my eyes and tried to imagine silence that did not feel like exile. I pictured shelves filled with books, a reading chair near the window, morning coffee taken without commentary. I imagined inviting Helen for dinner not as a guest seeking refuge, but as a hostess extending welcome. I think this is it, I said aloud before I could overthink it. Daniel reviewed the paperwork carefully. The purchase was feasible without draining my restored savings. When I signed the closing documents weeks later, my hand did not tremble. The pen moved steadily across the page, each stroke a declaration. Margaret Whitmore, homeowner. On the day I received the keys, I stood alone in the empty house and let the quiet settle around me. It did not feel lonely. It felt expansive. I walked from room to room slowly, touching walls, opening cabinets, testing light switches as though reacquainting myself with gravity. There were still unresolved tensions with Claire. We spoke occasionally, brief, careful conversations that avoided accusation but did not pretend amnesia. She expressed regret in fragments, sometimes sincere, sometimes defensive. I listened without absorbing responsibility for her discomfort. Boundaries, I was learning, are not walls. They are lines drawn with intention. One evening, as I unpacked a box of books in my new living room, my phone buzzed with a text from her. A photograph of the twins holding sparklers, their faces lit with joy. They miss you, she wrote. I studied the image carefully. I miss them too. But missing is not the same as surrendering autonomy. I typed back. I love them. I'm building something stable here. When we visit, it will be because we choose to, not because I have nowhere else to go. The reply came several minutes later. I understand. Or I'm trying to. It was not a perfect reconciliation. It was a beginning of a different kind. As summer deepened, I planted herbs in the backyard garden bed. Basil, rosemary, thyme. The soil resisted at first, compacted and stubborn. I worked it patiently, loosening what had hardened over time. Growth requires disturbance, I realized. Roots cannot spread in packed earth. One afternoon, while arranging books on freshly installed shelves, I paused and looked around the room. Sunlight filtered through curtains I had chosen myself. A kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. My pension deposits now arrived in an account I monitored personally. My decisions were no longer pre-approved by committee. For years, I had believed endurance was proof of love. Now I understood something quieter and far more powerful. Love without respect erodes the soul. Choosing myself had not destroyed my family. It had redefined my place within it. I was not the infrastructure of someone else's life anymore. I was the foundation of my own. Autumn arrived gently in Providence, brushing the maples outside my small craftsman house with gold and amber. I had lived there just over 3 months when I realized I no longer woke up with that subtle, familiar tension in my chest, the quiet anticipation of being corrected, redirected, or managed. The mornings belonged entirely to me. I decided when to rise, when to linger over coffee, when to step outside onto the porch and watch the neighborhood come alive. Independence, I discovered, is not loud. It does not announce itself with fireworks or declarations. It settles slowly into your bones until you realize you are breathing more deeply than you have in years. My days found rhythm. Twice a week, I volunteered at a nearby community literacy center, helping adults prepare for high school equivalency exams and assisting older residents with basic digital skills. The first afternoon I walked into that bright, slightly chaotic classroom, I felt a familiar spark. Whiteboards filled with practice essays. Laptops open to instructional websites. People leaning forward with cautious determination. I had not been a librarian merely to shelve books. I had been there to connect people with tools that allowed them to navigate their worlds. That part of me had not aged. If anything, it had sharpened. A man named Victor in his late 50s struggled with reading comprehension and apologized constantly for being slow. I recognized the shame immediately. Learning is not a race, I told him during one session. It's reclamation. He looked at me with surprise, as though no one had framed it that way before. I understood that look. I had worn it myself months earlier when Daniel Mercer told me I was not powerless. Helping others rediscover capacity reinforced my own. Meanwhile, Claire and I maintained cautious contact. Our conversations were measured, but no longer brittle. She asked about the house. I described the garden and the new curtains I had sewn for the living room. Sometimes she apologized again for how everything had unfolded. Sometimes she tried to justify decisions that, in hindsight, even she struggled to defend. I did not press. Healing is rarely accelerated by force. One Saturday in October, she asked if she could visit. The request caught me off guard. For years, I had entered her home quietly, adjusting to her rhythms. Now she would be entering mine. I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Boundaries once redrawn must be maintained with care. Yes, I said finally. You can come. When she arrived that afternoon, she stood on my porch looking smaller than I remembered. Not physically diminished, but uncertain. The confidence she had once carried so easily seemed tempered by something reflective. I opened the door and stepped aside to let her in. She paused in the entryway, taking in the hardwood floors, the shelves lined with books, the framed photographs I had chosen to display, some of her childhood, some of travels long before she was born. It's beautiful, she said quietly. It's peaceful, I corrected gently. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I now reviewed my own bank statements, planned my volunteer schedule, and wrote letters to old friends. I poured tea. She wrapped her hands around the mug, as though steadying herself. I thought I was helping, she began. I know you believed that, I replied. But I didn't ask you what you wanted, she continued. I just assumed. There it was. The core of it, assumption, not malice, not cruelty. Assumption layered over convenience. I stopped asking myself what I wanted to. I admitted. That's partly on me. She looked up sharply.
No.
It was our responsibility to include you. It was my responsibility to insist, I said softly. We sat with that shared truth. Accountability did not have to be a weapon. It could be a bridge. Claire explained that after I left, the house had felt different. Not lighter, as she had anticipated, but hollow. The twins had asked questions she struggled to answer. Stephen had grown defensive, then distant. Eventually, the strain revealed fractures in their marriage that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with unexamined habits of control. I'm not blaming you, she added quickly. I wouldn't accept it if you did. I replied, not unkindly. We did not solve everything that afternoon, but when she left, she hugged me with intention rather than obligation. The difference mattered. Over the following months, visits became more regular. Sometimes she came alone. Sometimes she brought the twins, who explored my backyard garden with the enthusiastic curiosity of children discovering new territory. I let them dig in the soil, plant bulbs for spring, and ask questions about books on my shelves. They did not see me as fragile or inconvenient. They saw me as present. And presence, I realized, is far more powerful than proximity. Financially, I remained vigilant. I reviewed statements monthly. I kept copies of important documents organized in a small filing cabinet near my desk. Daniel Mercer checked in periodically, not because crisis loomed, but because prevention is wiser than repair. I paid him for his time gladly. Independence is not isolation. It is informed choice. Winter settled over Providence, with quiet authority. Snow layered the porch railings and muffled the neighborhood into softness. Inside, my house glowed with lamplight and the steady warmth of a well-tended furnace. I hosted a small holiday dinner for Helen, a few fellow volunteers from the Literacy Center, and, after careful thought, Claire and the twins. The evening was simple. Laughter rose without tension. Conversation flowed without subtext. At one point, as I stood at the stove stirring a pot of soup, I felt a wave of awareness, so sudden it almost stopped me. I was not surviving. I was living. The distinction may seem subtle, but it reshaped everything. Survival had defined the years after my husband's death. Survival had guided my decision to move in with Claire, to pool finances, to shrink preferences for the sake of harmony. Survival is reactive. Living is deliberate. Later that night, after the guests had left and the dishes were washed, I stepped onto the porch despite the cold. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the streetlight. I thought back to that 4th of July barbecue in Portland, the moment my future had been toasted without my consent. At the time, I believed walking away might cost me everything. Instead, it cost me illusion. Illusion that love requires self-erasure. Illusion that aging equals irrelevance. Illusion that endurance is virtue. What replaced those illusions was something sturdier, self-respect. I no longer feared being alone. Solitude had become sanctuary rather than threat. My calendar filled with commitments I chose. My bank account reflected decisions I made. My relationships operated within boundaries I articulated. Claire and I were not restored to some idealized version of mother and daughter. We were something more honest. She had begun therapy, she told me once, to examine her tendency to equate control with care. I respected that effort. Growth, like forgiveness, cannot be demanded. It must be pursued. One afternoon in early spring, nearly a year after I left her house, Claire stood beside me in my garden as the first tulips pushed stubbornly through thawing soil. I was afraid, she admitted suddenly. Of what? I asked. Of watching you age. Of losing you. I thought if I controlled the environment, I could control the outcome. I considered her words carefully. Aging is not a problem to solve, I said. It's a process to respect. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. I do not know what the coming years will hold. None of us do. Bodies change. Circumstances shift. Independence may one day require adaptation. But the difference now is consent, choice, participation in the shaping of my own path. I have written a will. I have outlined healthcare preferences. I have organized finances transparently. Preparation is not surrender. It is stewardship. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this. Dignity does not diminish with age unless we allow others to define it for us. Walking away from that barbecue did not fracture my identity. It clarified it. I am still a mother, still a mentor, still a woman capable of contributing, deciding, and evolving. But above all, I am my own. And that is the life I chose.